thank you everybody for coming. We are delighted to have with us this evening Professor Brian DeMare from University of Tulane in the US. He is a cultural historian who spends most of his academic work looking at how Chinese citizens have navigated everyday life under Communist Party rule. He's here to talk about a book, his new book. Brian's last book, Land Wars, The Story of China's Agrarian Revolution, that was published in 2019 by Stanford University Press, was a very exciting relook at the land reform period in China, using new archival research to present a more complex and I think also more brutal account of that period of Chinese history, fundamentally trying to remake the countryside in a new socialist utopia in China. And one of the highlights of that book was its particular interweaving of this kind of new archival historical research with a very compelling narrative account. And I think that's something that comes through in this new book as well, Tiger, Tyrant, Bandit, Businessman, that was published last year, also by Stanford University Press. Again, there's this very kind of strong narrative thrust to a very interesting set of archival sources that I hope we'll have a chance to talk about in conversation. We're going to start off with Brian giving an overview of the book, and then we'll have some questions and some conversation for us as the speakers, and we'll also have about 20 minutes or so for audience questions and participation as well at the end. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Brian to tell us about the book, and then we will ask you some deep and penetrating questions about the way in which you've written it, the content, and all of that.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for that kind introduction. I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank King's College for the invitation, the Lau Institute, and I want to again thank Charlotte and Jane for coming to talk about land and land reform today. I was thinking today in my approach to land reform and history in general, I'm much like the frog in the well from the Zhuangzi, just in my little well, delightful to see the little world around me and to just see what I can learn, whereas Jane and Charlotte are much like those mythical birds in the Zhuangzi, flying over the well, seeing the vast terrain of China in terms of urban and rural spaces and even international comparisons. So I have no idea what our conversation is going to look like, but I'm very excited to have it take place. I am here today to talk about my new book, Tiger, Tyrant, Bandit, Businessman, and I will be, for the most part, focusing on my book, on the case files, on the narratives, on the sources, but because Charlotte and Jane are specialists in what I'll just call the land question, I am going to highlight what this new book talks or tells us about land reform, which is my long, ongoing research interest. I've written 3 books on rural revolution, and all of them more or less deal with the central problem of land reform, which I think is the central moment in Maoist revolution. It's when the Chinese Communist Party sent a work team to your village to divide peasants and landlords and make the revolution become a reality. So again, I'm going to talk about my book, but also I'm going to kind of highlight what the book says about land reform. Because I'm a historian, I must first talk about sources. All of my books, all of my research, it's all come from what sources I was able to find and not able to find, or maybe more accurately, not allowed to see. And my entire career, I've been looking for sources that really speak to the experiences of everyday rural citizens during Maoist rural revolution. So I'm not concerned so much with grand party proclamations about land reform or rural revolution. I really want to access what was it like on the ground when the Communist Party came to your corner of the Chinese countryside. And this book, one of the reasons I was so enraptured while I was writing it, so thrilled right now to be talking to you about this book, is because of the amazing sources that I was able to find. So the book is based on 4 case files from the Poyang County Public Security Bureau. I'll show you a map of Poyang in a moment, but Poyang is in northern Jiangxi province. So if you're thinking of China from north to south, as you move south and cross the Yangtze River, as soon as you cross the river, you arrive in Jiangxi province, and one of those counties right at the north is Poyang County. And in Poyang, as in all Chinese counties, you have a public security bureau, which is basically your local police force. And they're charged with keeping order, but in the early 1950s, one of the other things that they had very much on their minds was dealing with counter-revolution, both real and imagined. So in these 4 case files, each of them is a criminal investigation into an instance of counter-revolution in the very late 40s and early 1950s. And these documents are the greatest, most challenging documents I've ever had the honor of working with. You can imagine a case file just jammed full with random documents, so that if you picked it up and read it from back to forth, or back to front, it wouldn't really make a lot of sense. It took a lot of time to deal with all these various documents. So what are in these case files? You have reports. So this would be a overview, perhaps, written by a local police officer as to how they saw this criminal case, how they understood this instance of counter-revolution, who they thought was guilty, who they thought was innocent. You'd have witness statements by people who were kind of marginally involved in the case. One of my favorite is from a bandit attack in the mountains of northern Poyang, where some bandits came into a market town and they murdered some communists and burned down a local little shop where the communists were hiding. And then afterwards, the PSB, the Public Security Bureau, sent some police officers. They went, they interviewed a local townsperson who said, this is what I saw, the bandits came down from over there, this is what they did, this is how they set the building on fire, and by the way, this is all I know, I don't know anything else, I swear to God I'm innocent. They didn't swear to God, but they swore to the party that they were innocent and please leave them alone, and they don't have anything else to say. So you have all sorts of witness statements, you have accusations. This person is a landlord, this person is an evil tyrant, this person stole my land, this person slept with that person's wife. All sorts of accusations flying back and forth between neighbors. And what accusations are true, what accusations are false, are not necessarily clear when you read them in the case file, because it doesn't say this is a false accusation, there's just an accusation. And finally, you have all sorts of confessions. These are confessions by people who have been accused of these crimes. Sometimes they don't confess, they just say they're innocent. Sometimes they confess to one little crime. Sometimes they'll confess to a big crime. But even then, they will point out that actually the real criminal is somebody else. So as from that brief overview, I hope you can see that these documents are highly problematic. But beyond that, let me just focusing on some other issues. Number one, deciphering the files. These are all handwritten documents. Some of them are written by educated individuals with nice calligraphy, and you would read them and oh, what a joy. But most of them were written by people that I will describe here as semi-literate peasants. So there's a lot of mistakes, there's a lot of errors, names are wrong, place names are wrong. And I've talked to people who've worked on similar files. There's a growing subfield that I call Poyang studies. And when you talk to someone who works in Poyang studies and you talk about the files, they get this look on their face because they can't imagine all the time that they spent wasted staring at characters, hoping to figure out what that character meant. So even just understanding what's on the page was very difficult. And also this final issue of creators and audience. Who created the document in question? It's rarely clear. Very rarely are these documents signed by anyone. So you're not sure who wrote it. Even when they did, it's sometimes unclear. Another great document that I work with is a confession that's written by one person and signed by 3 people. So who is confessing? Whose voice is really in this document? It's really hard to tell. And also this issue of audience. Who are they writing for? I know who they weren't writing for. That's me. They weren't worried about me 70 years later trying to figure out what was going on. but most of these documents were created within the context of an ongoing criminal investigation that could very well end with one of the accused getting a bullet in the head. So when someone says, "I'm innocent," they're not just saying "I'm innocent" in their diary to themselves. They're saying "I'm innocent" in the context of a judge is going to read this document, and they really want to make sure that judge believes them because they do not want to be executed by the new regime. So these are the sources that I use for this book. Again, they're from Poyang County. You can see a map of Poyang here. You can see up top the Yangtze River, and flowing sometimes in, sometimes out is the Lake Poyang, which is a huge lake. It's the largest freshwater lake in China. The only reason that people in China who don't live in this area know about Poyang is because of the lake. It's incredibly famous. There's been some huge naval battles fought on its shores. And it's synonymous, of course, obviously, with the county, to the point that the official history of Poyang County, the cover is a picture of the lake, which I just want to point out two things. Doesn't make any sense. The lake is not part of the county, it's next to it. The second is that, as a historian, the lake is the least interesting thing about Poyang. What's interesting to me are the people who live there. And so in the book, this is what I'm trying to do, is to give voice, maybe not give voice, but to uncover the voices and experiences of the people who live there. All of these little places, by the way, I'll point out, with the exception of Poyang town, are utterly not important from a historical perspective. But in the case files, these are where many of the crimes take place, or bandit armies roam through. So this is kind of give you a sense of the location of the case files. And by happy coincidence, there's a good mix of investigations in various parts of the county. So these are the case files, and I know that I'm already behind time. So I'll just point out that originally today I was going to take you in a very detailed discussion of all 4 of the case files, but then about an hour and a half ago I've cut out the first 2. So I won't be talking about a large-scale bandit uprising when they teamed up with their old rivals, the Big Swords, to try to push the communists out of Poyang. I won't be telling you about Big Tiger, who is a big tough guy who brutally murdered People's Liberation Army political worker and avoided arrest for over 2 years, and maybe or maybe not got away with this crime. You'll have to read the book to find out. I'm going to focus instead on the second or the third and fourth case files, in part because these are the case files that I believe tell us the most about land reform, which again is something I've been researching for decades now, but this is my most intimate look at the countryside, I would say. So what do we learn about land reform when we have these really close readings of events in the Poyang countryside? So I'm going to tell you very briefly about the case of the Bodhisattva Society. This is the book's 3rd case file. And this is a very complicated narrative that I'm just going to tell you the basic structure of, but it involves land reform. And in Poyang, much as the case throughout China, land reform meant a work team coming to your village. So in China, I always like to say, is a vast nation of about 1 million villages. So land reform didn't happen in one place in one time. It happened in 1 million places over the course of about 5 years. So when a work team came to a village, it stayed there for a couple of weeks and tried to decipher local society. They wanted to figure out who was wealthy, who was poor, who was exploiting their neighbors, who was a class enemy, who could be struggled during land reform and have their property redistributed. But they also were able to delve into the history of a village and discover past crimes. And this is what happened in Poyang in one particular village. They actually uncovered a murder back in 1930. And one gentleman from one village was arrested as what we call an evil tyrant, which is a particular notorious label reserved for people who just were who abused and mistreated their neighbors during previous regimes. So during this case file, we see two men who were arrested as evil tyrants, and as would typically be the case, they were taken out of their village and put into the newly emerging criminal justice system. But then something very unique happened, something that I've never seen happen anyplace else, which is they broke out of detention and went on the run. And they were able to go and kind of sink back into local society and evade detection by the Public Security Bureau, which greatly troubled the police officers who were tasked with bringing these men to justice. And what basically happened is that the two men returned to one of their home villages, and they formed what was later called the Bodhisattva Society. Now, very quickly, in a Poyang village, the local religious life revolved around a statue of a bodhisattva, which is a religious figure. And the residents of the village got together around this statue and vowed to protect these two runaway evil tyrants from the police. And what I want to note here, the first thing I want to note is land reform had already been completed. So you already have struggling of landlords, redistribution of land, you have a new Communist Party sanctioned local elite put in place, and all of these people agree that they want to protect these two evil tyrants from the police, and they're actually pretty successful in doing so. Now, when the police look at what they later will call the Bodhisattva Society, they see it as part of a vast conspiracy of counter-revolution, and they link all of these different groups with the Bodhisattva Society. But on their own, they're not able to locate these two men. But just when they're about to give up, another landlord turns himself in. He had run away from land reform in his village and had no place to go. He himself was a criminal on the run, but he offered what was later called a thread. He thought he could find these two runaway evil tyrants. And so the police officers have him go undercover and send him to the village to try to basically figure out where these two guys are. And the narrative tension in this case file is, can this runaway undercover agent landlord find them, and can he bring them, and can the police officers bring them to justice? So that's kind of this case file very briefly. And in terms of what this teaches us about land reform, I think the first thing it shows is the importance of these work teams who, what we call sitting on point. They go to a village and they stay there. And they ask questions and they meet with people and they dig and they dig and they dig. And they're actually able to get some actually really good information from their local informants. At the same time, even though they were able to uncover this old murder and get someone arrested, when that person who had been arrested came back to the village, he was protected by his family members. And the people who were in what was called the Bodhisattva Society, one thing I want to emphasize, they might have not have known that they were in a counter-revolutionary organization called the Bodhisattva Society. It's pretty likely that they just saw themselves as protecting their uncle or someone that was in their family. But the thing was, and we see in the case file, is that the police officers, when they looked at the countryside, they saw counter-revolution everywhere. So these people were not just helping out a neighbor or a family member, they were part of a vast counter-revolutionary network that needed to be broken into and crushed. So you see very different ways of kind of seeing the same events. A villager who's helping out his relative will see things one way. A police officer who's investigating the case and also filing a report that goes into the archive will see things very differently. All right, very quickly I want to talk about the next and final case file of the book, which is Merchant Jia Goes to Court, which is another case file that speaks directly to land reform. Merchant Jia is an unlucky businessman who finds himself accused of spying for a nationalist army. Very quickly, before the communists come to Poyang, a nationalist general named General Li Fengchun comes to Poyang and organizes another army that he nicknames the Ninth Route Army, which is an homage to the communist famed Eighth Route Army. And they attempt to forestall the arrival of the PLA. They fail spectacularly. But a lot of people die along the way. And if anyone accuses someone in Poyang of being affiliated with the Ninth Route Army, it was a very dangerous accusation. In the Cultural Revolution, this was something that you could accuse someone of. So in the 1950s, this was also a very powerful charge. And what we see is that Merchant Jia was accused by his neighbors of being a spy for the Ninth Route Army and asked the communist and the new legal system to execute him. They specifically asked for him to be killed because he was a spy. So this is one of the ones where if you read the case file not so carefully, you will just say, okay, Merchant Jia is a spy. You got to dig in a little bit deeper to see the truth behind this case. So Merchant Jia was not from Poyang. He was from Wuyuan County, which is right next to Poyang. But in Poyang, like a lot of places in China, it's really local. So if you're not from Poyang, you might as well be from Mars. So Merchant Jia, for various reasons, leaves his hometown, comes to Poyang. He works as a banker. He works for the nationalists. When the communist comes, he works for the communists. And after working for the communists for a while, he leaves government work and opens an oil press. So he goes into the private sector. He opens a business in the countryside right before land reform starts. And he rents this oil press from a landlord. That landlord takes the money and leaves Poyang, and where he goes, we don't know. Maybe he got to Hong Kong or Taiwan, maybe he didn't, who knows, but he's gone. So when land reform starts, the local cadres, they're looking for wealth to redistribute, and they see in this oil press that used to be owned by a landlord, a lot of grain, a team of oxen, and a lot of wealth. And what they want to do is they want to take that and redistribute it. Merchant Jia has read the land reform law, which says these kind of rural enterprises are not supposed to be confiscated. So he argues with the cadres, he goes over their heads, he complains to the local government. The local cadres get very annoyed with him. They have a mass rally and they convince about 300 of his neighbors to accuse him of being a spy. And so he's tried as a spy. There's a lengthy court process, and the narrative tension in this case is basically what's going to happen to Merchant Jia. I can tell you right now, he was not a spy, but the masses have called for his execution. So what's going to happen to him? And again, I'm going to encourage you all to read the book to find out what's going to happen. I apologize for not spoiling these things, but when I wrote this book, I wrote it so people would read it. So I'm going to ask you to actually read the book and read this story and all of the other great stories that are in the book. But what do we learn about land reform from this case? Again, insiders versus outsiders. This is one of the big themes of the book. For people in Poyang, if someone comes from outside the county, they're an outsider. If it's Merchant Jia from Wuyuan, they're outsiders. If they're the cadres who come from North China to take over the local government, they're outsiders as well. We see the power of local cadres during land reform who could do things like frame people with the wrong class label and ruin their lives, get them arrested. And that ties into the flexibility of labels. Merchant Jia, let me emphasize this, was not a spy for the Ninth Route Army. He wasn't even from Poyang, so why would he feel this need to team up with General Li to keep the communists out of Poyang? It's absolutely ridiculous. But the label attached onto him so easily in a way that a lot of class labels were attached to Chinese citizens during this period. It was very easy for someone who was a wealthy farmer to be labeled as a landlord and that class label would stick with that person, their kids, and their grandkids. And finally, I just want to note the ambiguity of land reform laws. And nowhere in the land reform law does it clearly say what's supposed to happen when you rent a rural enterprise from a landlord right before land reform started. So the legality of what Merchant Jia was doing, it should be legal, but it was very easy to interpret his actions as being subversive and trying to what we call wreck land reform. Okay, so those are 2 of the 4 case files. I wish I could tell you about all of them, but I do not have time. In closing, I just want to point out, so this is my 3rd book about rural revolution. My first book was about drama troops, and there was a big chunk of that about how they function during land reform. My second book, the now highly controversial land wars, I'm very excited about how some people really hate this book now, is about what happens inside your village when that work team comes and follows what I call the script of land reform. And this is my new one, which I think offers the most intimate look at land reform and rural revolution. So I wanted to first introduce you all to my scholarship, but I also wanted to use this moment to make an announcement that I have not said previously in front of anyone. I wanted to do it with Charlotte and Jane here as the experts of the field. I wanted to do it, hold on, someplace public, is that this is my 3rd and my final book on rural revolution. I have working on this topic for 20 years. I've written 3 books about it, and I'm going to move on to a new topic. Hopefully one where no one gets buried alive. That's my goal. But yeah, this is it. This is it. So the trilogy is complete, and I'm still very happy to. Obviously, this book just came out. I hope to be talking about it for years. But in terms of going forward, I think I have actually said what I really want to say about this moment in Chinese history, and I'm ready to move on. So that was the surprise announcement. I hope everyone is just shocked. Hold on, I'm going the wrong way. In closing, I want to thank everyone for coming out. To me, this is a wonderful turnout. And we're going to have a conversation. We're going to have some Q&A. And if you want to reach out later on, please shoot me an email and ask a question or give me a comment. I'm always excited to talk about rural revolution with people who care about rural revolution. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay, now we have lights. You can actually see what we're doing. Great, thank you for that very informative overview of half of your book, in fact, not the first one.
Just half.
Yes, I really enjoyed reading this. I think as I highlighted at the beginning, one of the things I most enjoyed was the way that you mixed together the kind of narrative. I felt like I was reading true crime, what's going to happen, and what's going to happen to Merchant Jia, and all the way through there are these characters that you sort of want to find out what happens to. And in a way that's kind of disappointing, because then you finish the book and you don't tell us, ultimately, their longer term trajectories, and of course that's one of the frustrating things with working about these kinds of sources, I can imagine. But I really enjoyed reading that sort of mixture of narrative, compelling narrative, with really careful archival work, and I think there should be more academic works like that. So that I really enjoyed that aspect. Jane has got a lot of questions for you, but I won't go through all of them. No, I've seen the draft, and you won't. But I wanted to just kick off a little bit with a question, because I had a couple of things I wanted to ask, and one is about the sources. I'm really curious. I've never done this kind of really deep archival work with this sort of sources. So I wanted to know how you found the sources. How did you even know that they existed? How did you get access to them? Was that straightforward? And then what was it like working with what sounds like a very complicated and at times difficult to follow set of sources? The reason I'm asking that, or part of the reason I'm asking that, or part is just interest, is how you did it. But I'm also very curious about this idea that the sources, that there is a kind of truth in there. You said, when you were talking about Merchant Jia, and you said, well, I'm going to give away a bit of the ending, which is that he wasn't a spy, definitely. The truth is he didn't do that. You are obviously presenting a particular interpretation of the sources in which you pick out what the truth of the matter is, and I wonder to what extent you can really do that with this kind of sources. So I would love to hear your views on what it's, how you found the sources and access them, what it's like to work with them, and can you really tell the truth from these sorts of sources?
Okay, I'm going to be a little bit coy about the exact place I found these sources, because these questions are incredibly politically sensitive right now in China. So what I'll say is that I lived in China from 2001 to 2006, and I spent the entire time trying to find sources, and specifically a lot of times visiting state-run archives. And there's a real limit to what you can and cannot see in these archives. So I wrote my dissertation on land reform political culture, but when I went to state-run archives, I was not able to see any documents on land reform. It's just too sensitive. So instead, what I would say is that I'm a huge fan of Chinese opera, which is a lie, and I want to learn more about drama troupes in the 1940s and 50s. And I really love opera, really emphasize that. And the archivists would say, okay, yeah, sure, you can see some drama troupe documents. And of course, the thing about China is that everything is political. So when you look at drama troupe archives from 1950 to 1955, there's a lot of political content. You can also see how they function during various political campaigns. And so that was the first book. For the second book, I was able to get some better archives for land reform, and some of them were published. So there was kind of two published types of documents. One was documents that were published by the Chinese Communist Party for internal distribution. So it was only only for inside eyes. But just the nature of the way that books work, and I know that having published is after you publish it, it just goes out there and you can't control where it goes. So those are pretty easy to find. And there are also some Chinese academics who would go to archives, state archives, and get documents and then kind of what we call zhengli them. So go through them and kind of fix them up and then publish them abroad. So there's actually a good collection that was published in New Zealand, of all places. Let me segue to the second and much more difficult question about truth in the archives. So this is partly just my inclination that there's got to be something that you can know for sure when you're dealing with these kind of historical materials, because otherwise I think it's just too depressing to not being able to say anything with any certainty. And I'll go to Merchant Jia, because I think he's a great example, because the documentation in this case, it's really astounding how there's a lot of Merchant Jia's own voice. And there's, when you're reading his statements, and he says a lot of things. You can tell he's a very proud person who really feels he's right. And he just can't believe that he's being railroaded by what he sees are obvious lies. But, at some point he's thrown in jail, and he's in jail, and there's a couple of sentences where he describes what it's like to be in jail in Poyang, and he's like, I'm miserable. I only have one shirt. I have no clothes to change into. I'm far from home, so there's no one to come and bring me anything else. And I really hope we can resolve this so I can get on with my life. And when I read that, it just rings true with everything I know about the Chinese legal system and what it means to be in jail. So when I read that, I just feel that this is really an accurate description. Now, I know this is just my feeling there. Let me go back to something a bit more substantive. Is that when I'm working on these documents, I actually do believe that I wasn't the only person involved in these documents who was searching for truth. I know that I've often been accused of being a critic of the Chinese Communist Party, and I'm certainly critical. But I really do think that, first of all, in land reform, I'll point out a lot of great things happened during land reform. A lot of poor farmers got land, and that needs to be acknowledged. When you look at the legal system, you really do have a sense that they were also interested in figuring out what was going on. So the documents, when I read, I guess to answer your question is like, there's no way to know for sure, like what the absolute truth is, okay? And I think that I try to acknowledge that in the book, is that I'm just doing my best. But in terms of the documents, there are statements that just ring so true that it really strikes me. But also in terms of the legal proceedings, that you have situations where there'll be a verdict, and then later on the verdict will be overturned because the first verdict got it wrong. So I felt comfortable that the legal system that I was looking at was not a sham court, even though I want to emphasize here that the judges were not like judges like you would imagine. They were just cadres. They were just, they had no legal training. They're not, they didn't graduate from, law school or anything, right? But they were interested in figuring out what was going on. And part of that, I guess, is because they were outsiders like I was an outsider. That we were both trying to decipher what was going on. But again, to a certain extent, I think the locals were trying to bamboozle both myself and the cadres because it was in their interest to keep outsiders out. So to go back and try to re-answer that second question, I want to emphasize that it's interpretive, but you just do the best you can. And also I'll note that there were other sources involved, so the local history I used was actually very helpful. There have been studies of Poyang by different scholars, but ultimately it's interpretive. That said, I might be naive, but I do believe that as a historian, I am able to uncover some sort of truth in the archive. But I also will note that, I note in the book, like I don't say there might, I say there are mistakes in this book, because just the nature of the sources are such that it would be impossible to write a book based on such fractured, contradictory sources and get everything right.
Great, thank you. I love this idea of you and the judges working together as this kind of team to work out the historical truth with slightly different motives and angles, I suspect, but I like this idea. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Jane Hayward from the Lau China Institute. Jane works on rural China, land, and the agrarian question in contemporary China. I know she's got some questions for you. So Jane, do you want to...
Here are my questions. Look, there's nearly 2 pages here. And we've almost run out of time. So I'm just going to be able to ask you one, unfortunately. Congratulations, it's a great book. It's a really fun read, I should say, first of all. Also, a quick shout out to Land Wars. Did you know that I reviewed it?
I did, I remember.
You did? I thought you hadn't.
No, but I did, because it actually, and you mentioned Toby and his work. And Toby was the last reviewer of the book.
Oh, okay.
So there's like a whole circle of life thing going on.
That's nice, because I reviewed it a couple of years ago and I thought maybe you hadn't made the connection.
No, I made the connection, but also because in the parts I cut out on the first case file, because it's about war, and that was, remember, it was your comment was like, this is violent. So there was a whole thing. There was a whole thing going on.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let me get to my question. A really strong theme throughout the book, and it seems to me perhaps how it came across to me, almost the central thesis of the book, if there is one, and you may be interested to know if you agree, is how in fact the communists come in, and as you talk about the importance of this sense of insiders versus outsiders, and they are understood as outsiders by a lot of people, and there's a lot of pushback against them. And it seems to me that your sense is that the extent to which there was pushback against the communists when they tried to come into these villages has been underplayed somehow. So you want to emphasize that in this book. That's what I took from it. But here's the actual question. Who is your audience? And I'm not asking that in a bland sense. I'm asking it for this reason. You make a comment right at the end, which I'll read. You say this: the leaders of the People's Republic of China, from Mao Zedong to Xi Jinping, have long prided themselves as master storytellers. Seldom do they welcome others, particularly outsiders, to tell those stories. Much better to dictate the narrative and decide what is fake and what is true. But I am deeply suspicious of attempts to control narratives of the past. So there's an implication here that you are writing this against the narratives put out by people like Xi Jinping. And yet, if you're teaching in the United States, or indeed over here, this is an English language book, generally a lot of people in the United States don't take Xi Jinping's narratives terribly seriously. So, who did you write this for? Did you write it for, I heard you say on a podcast you wrote it for students. Did you write it for Chinese students? If not, who did you write it for?
I wish I could write this book for Chinese students, but I started the project with the explicit understanding that this book will never be translated into Chinese. It's never going to happen.
But there are a lot of Chinese students over here.
There are a lot of Chinese students over here. And so what I would say is that I wrote the book primarily for students in the West. And the reason I would say that is because it's about the problem of working with narratives and working with archives and turning archives into history, and the problems inherent in that enterprise. The comment at the end of the book, it is true. This is a larger comment that is probably kind of divorced from the initial audience of the book, right? So this is, and what I would say is probably the closing of the book, which would normally be called the conclusion, but I call it a few more words in closing.
Because you're trying to get away from the idea that this is a conventional academic book.
I am. This book is structured as a spoonful of sugar, almost, to introduce students to archives, to introduce them to rural China, to introduce them to Maoist revolution, to also introduce them to a multitude of issues that animated life in rural China, from superstitious practices that the big sword men believed in, that they thought they were invulnerable to bullets, to the role of religion in rural society, to the conscription practices of the Nationalist Party. So I used narratives as a way to draw in readers, mostly student readers, to kind of get them to actually care about rural China. What I would say is that, I've written 3 books about rural China, and one thing I've learned is that most modern, Western, educated people don't spend a lot of time thinking about rural China now or in the past. So what I really wanted to do was to get people, if not to care, then to pay attention. Now, the closing line was, I guess, my recognition of that this problem that I have is greatly complicated by what's going on in China right now. And there are a lot of pushback against people like me who are trying to think critically about the history of China, modern China, and the Chinese Communist Party. I don't think of myself as someone who is overtly critical of the Chinese Communist Party. I really believe that. I think some people who hear me say that will be incredulous. How could you say that? But I try in my work to continually emphasize the many successes of the Chinese Communist Party, the many things they've done well. The problem is that you can't talk about Chinese history in a nuanced way in China right now. So what I would like to do with this book and my research in general is to just start a conversation and get feedback from people in China and academics in China and readers in China. But at this moment, I also am very much aware that that is completely a non-starter.
Have I got time for one more?
Yes, go on. Only if you ask that one. Were you going to ask that one? I want to hear the answer to that one.
But you kind of asked that one. Oh, okay.
I want to hear it again.
I'm going to phrase it differently.
Right.
I started that question by saying my understanding of your sort of central thesis was that this is largely about how much pushback there was in the villages to the communists. You talk about secret societies pushing back, you talk about elites pushing back against the communists. Am I right in thinking that's more or less your central thesis? And this is the question that Charlotte was pointing to. From the same documents, would you also be able to interpret it differently to see a very different thesis? In other words, did you specifically go out and look for that? To what extent is it really, really strongly there in the documents, or did you pull those parts out because that was the story you wanted to tell?
So I would agree that reading the book, you could argue that the central thesis of the book is that there was more resistance than it's been commonly presumed. At the same time, I would point out that the documents I used to create the book are criminal cases of counter-revolution. So it's a question of when you look at things from a certain angle, that's what you're going to find. So I don't think, well, I know, at no point in the book do I say, this book proves that there was more pushback than commonly believed. Because I don't think I would argue that. I would argue that there was a lot of pushback. You can see it in all these different ways. But I am not explicitly making that argument. And I do believe that you could look at these documents and argue the opposite. And argue that, especially when you look at the things that the legal system got right, that you could make the case that the regime change went smoother than some people expected because of this specific reason, which is the judicial system took into account the will and wants of the masses. You see it multiple times where the court would actually poll public opinion. And they would basically ask people, what do you want to happen to Big Tiger, who, I'll remind you, brutally murdered a PLA grain collector? And people would say, we think he should serve a short prison term. And they would listen to that, and they would pass judgments based on that. And what I would say in general, and I think that some readers of the book will be annoyed by this, is that there's no one big argument. For example, I don't say this is the nature of state and society relations with the arrival of the Communist Party. I recently gave a talk, and there was a senior political scientist who started to ask a question where I thought she was going to ask me that. And I felt some sweat start to drip down my face because I'm a historian. I was just trying to tell some good stories. But part of the reason I did that was because this book is for student readers, and I wanted student readers to be able to read these case files and then come up with their own arguments and use the book to back it up. I teach undergraduate students, and it's hard to find things to assign to them that they want to read. So what I wanted to do was write something that was readable, that could be interpreted both ways. And so I think I really appreciate that question, because that's kind of the dream, is that you have this criminal case, and then you can use it to give your interpretation of the revolution. And I think that if you read my books together, you'll see my interpretation, which is it's really complicated, and it defies simple explanation. Land reform happened in 1 million villages, and to have one overarching theory is well, it's not my job. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was something I also felt strongly while reading it. You know, that there is another story that could be told here on, you know, the idea that the countryside was overrun with bandits and secret societies and local elites making people's lives difficult, and the communists came in and sorted all of that out. As you say, it's a lot more complex, but this could suit another narrative here, quite different from yours, I think.
Which is why, like, I would hope that this book would be available to be translated into Chinese, and people in China, you can read this book and see that interpretation. I totally agree.
Great. Okay, let's open it up to questions from everybody else. You're bored of listening to us talk. Please, let's take some questions from the audience. Who wants to start us off? Could you please introduce yourselves just before you ask your question? Yeah, please.
Thank you for the talk. If one casts one's thoughts back to what's happened in China for the last 100 or more years, it's been a very turbulent country. The Boxer Revolution was by far was nothing like the only thing that happened. They deposed an emperor, they had a civil war, they then had a political revolution. You've talked a lot about counter-revolution and pushback. Have you any sense of how dangerous the events were that you describe in your book and which were being assessed by the courts in China?
Would you mind introducing yourself for the speaker as well, please?
Yes, sorry. I'm Terence Bendix, and I'm an affiliate of the Lau Institute.
Thank you for your question. The quick answer is incredibly dangerous. So I'll just point to that last case file I was talking about with Merchant Jia and the 9th Routh Army in Poyang. The accusations were deadly. So if you were successfully labeled a spy, you would be executed. And it didn't stop in the 1950s. So I think you mentioned the Cultural Revolution. So if we jump forward to the actual Cultural Revolution in Poyang, this was still a very dangerous accusation. So Poyang is in most regards a very typical and average place, but there happens to be a couple of very good studies of one of the villages in Poyang written by Mobile Gao, who was from Poyang. And he wrote about his home village, Gao Village. And during the Cultural Revolution, this was still an accusation that villagers could accuse each other of. So during the Cultural Revolution, if you could successfully convince your neighbors that one of your other neighbors had been an affiliate with the 9th Routh Army, you'd be struggled, be beaten up, all the bad things that happened in the Cultural Revolution. So the charges that were leveled during this period were absolutely deadly.
Great, thank you. More questions? Anybody else have something that they would like to ask? One, and then two, and then three. Okay, yeah, please.
My name's Adam. Does this have an afterlife? So apart from at the political level, the political sensitivity of it today, does it have an afterlife at the societal level? Do people in villages still remember what happened? Do they hold grudges, anything like that?
100%. Well, up through the Maoist period, 100%. So during land reform, your family, or all families, were given a class label. And I talk about this in some other contexts, but that makes sense from a Maoist and Marxist perspective, that you'll be given a class label based on your relationship to agricultural production and exploitation in 1950, for example. But what happens after that is very un-Marxist, in that it becomes a hereditary class label, completely divorced from the economic reality of the village economy. So you have generations of quote-unquote landlords who are actually the poorest people in the village. So, and if you were classed as a poor peasant, you could actually be one of the more privileged people in your village and have access to education and village political power. So the events of land reform and these years are determinative for the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Now, after the 80s, one thing that I believe is that once we get rid of the class labels, things kind of very quickly go back to normal. There's kind of like a mass amnesia where people don't want to talk about how they used to terrorize that one family, and they try to go and move on. But the events that I talk about in these books, they're not just important for those years. It's actually going to set the groundwork for village society for the next few decades.
Can I very briefly piggyback on that question? I know you've got questions waiting, but I was also really tempted to ask you this, whether you were ever, interested to go and talk to any people in the village about these specific events. I know they're 70 odd years ago, but there must be the children or relatives of these people. Did you ever consider doing that sort of research?
100% tempted, had plans, COVID happened,
Okay.
the world changed. But there's two things I'll say. One is that it was 70 years ago.
Yeah.
The other is that, and this relates to that, so much has changed in China. The pace of change is so fast that I doubt I would be able to get anything very useful. The other is that one of the big locations I was looking at, it's where an attack on a work team happened. It's a place called Hengyong. And I was looking on Google Maps and Baidu Maps for about 6 months trying to find it, only to eventually realize that the entire township had been flooded by a reservoir, just completely buried underwater. It no longer exists. So that's one case where, I could go to the reservoir and try to peer down, but no, I didn't. I would have loved to at the very least have gone and to see Poyang, but it didn't work out for me. But I doubt there would be much that I could discover.
That makes sense. Yeah, thank you. I had another question up
Yeah,
here.
my name is Aneko. I'm a student here at the Lau Institute. I actually bought longboards a few years ago. I didn't know it was the same person, so wasn't surprised. I was hoping we could go back to the Bodhisattva Society and talk about the role of religion, the general trend of land reform and how maybe perceptions of religion in the Communist Party were played out in that case.
Okay, so incredibly religious society, but a rather wild form of Buddhism. So everyone was Buddhist, but there weren't a lot of monasteries, there wasn't a lot of control. So it was a very indigenous and local form of Buddhism that kind of just developed in its own way. As I said, each village would have its own pusa statue. And, I guess what I'll say is from the case files, this case file in question was mostly written by police officers who did not care at all about this statue. They don't describe it, they just say there was a statue. So is it a Guanyin? Is it an Arhat? I have no idea. But this was the centerpiece of local religious life. As I said, high child mortality rates. It was the only thing you had to give you comfort was religion. So it was central to village life. The Communist Party saw it as superstition and aimed to kind of root that out. They were completely unsuccessful. I mean, there's two things that what you learn by reading the larger literature about Poyang, is that family life and religion are still very, very important in today's Poyang. So those were two big targets for the Communist Party. Neither one of them were successfully eliminated. People still organize their lives in terms of family and lineage, and they still have those bodhisattva statues.
Yeah, next question.
Mine was actually also about the Bodhisattva Society. So, were they deemed counter-revolutionaries only in the sense that they protected those who were deemed to be counter-revolutionaries, or were they actually actively acting against land reform in any way? And were there sort of organised counter-revolutionaries in that sense that were actually acting against land reform?
Would you mind introducing yourself as well? Sorry.
I will.
So they, for the most part, all they were doing was protecting their neighbors. But because these neighbors were evil tyrants, this was considered trying to wreck and destroy land reform. Although in this case, land reform had already happened. What I want to emphasize, I think, for your question, though, is the way that the Bodhisattva Society rituals were described. So according to police officers, they did all sorts of rituals that are secret society rituals. So the big one was they would slaughter a rooster, mix its blood with wine, and drink it, and then swore this collective oath. And this is a very stereotypical secret society ritual. So did they do that? You know, like I talked about in the introduction to the talk, the documents are very problematic. You don't know who wrote certain things. There's certain kind of statements. For that particular part of the case, right? So that these guys, and they're all guys, and I want to emphasize again, some of them are they're the new leadership in the village. They are, land reform has already happened, right? And they're like, land reform is done. I'm now the village head, and I'm now here drinking rooster blood with these other people in this basically this secret society ritual. So that also marked them as counter-revolutionaries, because secret societies were now counter-revolutionary groups. So the way they're portrayed in the files is as a secret society group that was linked up with other secret society groups in a vast network that was determined to push back against the communists and therefore bring back the Nationalist Party. But you also have this one member of the quote-unquote Bodhisattva Society, this guy named Kwong No. 4, who's a poor peasant. He's just a farmer, and all he knows is that there's some guys who are hiding out, and he's supposed to kind of help keep it secret. So is he actively planning for the return of Chiang Kai-shek? Probably not.
Thank you. Any further questions? Is there anything else? Yeah, we have one up here.
Hi, my name's Kellen. I was really interested when you mentioned in the future, in cases of changing geopolitical circumstances, that there might be other people who would be after case files like the four that you've explored. I was wondering, who do you think those people might be, and what utility might they have for them, or what interest might they have for them?
Well, they will most certainly be PhD students studying Chinese history who are able to access these files. I really can't say much more about that, except that I wish them well. You know, these case files are really difficult to work with. And I want to emphasize, there's a lot of them. So I looked at 4. There are, I can't remember the exact number. It's either over 7,000 or 9,000 of them.
Just for Poyang?
Just for Poyang. So you can get a sense of how much is out there. And I just believe that eventually, you know, I talk about this with my students all the time. Things right now between China and the US are really bad. They were also really, really bad many other times in the past 50 years. So if history tells us anything, in 10 years, you know, I'll be back in Beijing, you know, giving a lecture at Beida, right? It seems unimaginable now, but that's what history tells us. So I think that those case files are out there. There's a lot of other case files that are similar to this. And I guess what I'll say is that I'm excited to see how people use them. So I wrote, as Charlotte mentioned, a very narrative-based book. And I know you said you wish that there were more books like this, but also I don't want all books to be like this, right? This is a very kind of particular book with a particular purpose. But I think that these case files can be used in a whole manner of ways. And I think just go back to this question of like, even this book, if you read it, if you can argue both ways about what the meaning of the party arrived, then that's great. So I'm not sure if that perfectly answers your question, but it's I think that this is one of my greatest weaknesses, is that I'm an eternal optimist, but I just can't stop myself from believing that eventually that these case files and a lot more archival documents will be available for people to see, because, and I want to go back to this, I believe if you read them and you use them fairly, the story of the the story of the Chinese Communist Party is one of great successes and great failures. And the point of history is to look at both of them with a fair and open mind. It's very difficult to do right now. And that's why I find myself as someone who's often under attack for trying to do that. But I think that eventually that all these things are going to come to light and we'll be able to have actually a reasonable discussion about it. That time is not now.
That's fascinating. I'd be particularly interested in what you said, a chance remark you made about the judges and how they were not sort of stooges, but they were really trying to investigate and understand what had happened despite their total lack of legal training. I can imagine a fascinating study based on these sources to look at that kind of thing and how the legal system operated in this way. Very different sort of book, but it will be fascinating.
Yeah, and I'll point out that there are, every time, not every time, but I'm continually meeting people who are working with these documents. So the field of Poyang studies, like I talk about it, it's almost silly, but I do believe that in 10 years that people besides myself will use the term Poyang studies as an actual field of study.
Great, thank you. We have time for just one last question if anybody wants to finish up. If there's one more. Yes.
Hi, my name is Wen Yuan, and I'm also a current master student at the Lau China Institute. I'm very interested with that if anyone who questions your results of your research when you're doing your research, such as, oh, this is not like what you are saying, you focus on the Chinese drama or the opera, but you are trying to access very sensitive political historical documents, and if they are willing to help you to do that.
So what was the question? I'm not sure I got it correctly.
Anyone try when you're doing your research, trying to question your purpose of getting access any documents.
So a lot of archivists did. So when you go to the archives in China, especially I should note, even Chinese researchers have difficulty accessing these sources. So, but for me as a foreigner, it's especially so. And what I would say is that for a lot of archivists, someone like me is just a bother and just trouble. And it'd be a lot better if I just left them alone and went away. So there was a lot of situations where I would go to an archive, especially a county archive. Again, so that's the kind of sources that I got for this book. And they just wouldn't let me see anything. They would say, you need to have a letter of recommendation or letter of introduction. And I would show them my letter of introduction from Tsinghua Dashui, right? It's a good school. And they say that we don't care about that. You need it from a local school. So there's a lot of times where it's just impossible to see anything. And that's part of the reason why I spent so long in China, was that it was a process of, in China, Chinese is this great term, pengdingzi. It's like when you run into trouble. It's like you hit a snag. And you almost have to expect that's going to happen. And so you go to the archive and they say no, and you say, what's it going to take for you to say yes? You say, oh, okay. Then you go back and you keep on trying, you keep on trying, you keep on trying. So that is, if for a master's student such as yourself or any other grad students here, I would just say you have to be patient and you have to keep on trying, and you can't take the no's personally, because there's going to be a lot of no's, and you just have to keep on grinding and grinding. At the same time, I know I say that it's almost like a recipe for very bad mental health, to just like, I think there's a conversation going on right now about the concept of ku, or bitterness, right? And like, whether or not we should use this phrase anymore. But, it's, studying Chinese history is really difficult, but it takes time and patience. But like I said, I'm an eternal optimist, so I think that in the end, things will work out.
Great, it's nice to end on an optimistic
Yes.
note here. Am I allowed to ask what you're going to do next? Do you have this sort of shock announcement that that's it, no more rural China for me? Am I allowed to ask what actually comes next?
You're allowed to ask what comes next, and what I'm going. I have a lot of. Well, first I'll say I am currently department chair, so I don't do a lot of research anymore. I mostly manage my colleagues. But what I want to do is I want to study a period in Chinese history that I find personally appealing, because it was a time when China was very open to global trends, and that is the late 1990s and early 2000s. I think that period of Chinese history is very unique in terms of the openness of China, and there's a lot of interesting things that happened during that period. So I have a friend, Zhang Xiaojun, who's an anthropologist in China, and we used to talk a lot during the late 90s and early 2000s, and he would say that Chinese culture has a haowar, the culture. There's a playful culture that like to take trends from different places and adapt them to local sensibilities. And it's very different from what I've done so far, obviously, and I'm not sure, I don't have a timeline for anything is what I'll say, because I'm so busy as chair. But I want to try to do something different. And like I said, I hope that everyone will read this book. I poured a lot of my heart and soul into it, but it really does accomplish everything that I've been trying to accomplish as a historian of rural China. So I really would like to move on to something else. And at the moment, I just have the late 90s and early 2000s as just a moment in Chinese history that I would like to delve into. And also, no one gets buried alive during that, not that I know of. So the working on rural revolution, it's fascinating, but it also, there's a lot of mass torture, mass murder, mass sexual assault. It's a very difficult time to work on. So I think after 3 books, it's time for me and my mental health to step away. But that said, I already know that there's a new generation of scholars who are coming up, who are working on this. I'm happy to cede the field to them and see what they can do with it.
I preferred the ending note where you said everything's going to be optimistic and we'll get back into China, less the one about mass torture. But on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much again to Professor Brian DeMare for joining us.